Good morning, welcome back. Today is January 8th, and I figured one more day in the decoration bestrewn living room before we go back downstairs to the non-decoration bestrewn library room or back out into the cold, wet deck. But yes, today is January 8th, and what happened on this date? Well, first of all, it was on this date in 1324 that Marco Polo died. Now, I don't know where that is in relation to the creation of the game or not, but on this date, 1324, Marco Polo, the great explorer, discovered the spice routes to China or India, I believe. He was born on this date, he died on this date in 1324. Also dying on this date in 1539, charred reindeers, T-J-A-R-D, R-E-Y-N-D-E-R-S, charred reindeers. Charred reindeers, crime for which he was executed was sheltering Menno Simons. Menno Simons, the great Anabaptist, and who later kind of took over the whole movement, so that nowadays when you talk about the Anabaptist movement, you find them in the Mennonites, the followers of Menno Simons. So for sheltering Menno Simons, charred reindeers was executed. It was on this date in 1815 that the Battle of New Orleans took place. You know, 1814, we took a little trip along with Colonel Jackson down the mighty Mississippi. Battle of New Orleans, I think everybody who's taken U.S. history knows that one of the interesting things about the Battle of New Orleans is that it takes place approximately 2 weeks after the end of the War of 1812. But because of the way that communication went back in the day, they had to wait for things to come across the ocean on ship. Nobody in the colonies, or nobody in the States, I should say at this point, knew that. So the battle went on, and I guess fortunately for the U.S., won rather handily. It was kind of an interesting battle. There was a river on one side, and there was like a tree line on the other, and then the U.S. forces were here, and the British kept coming into this valley and getting shot. So it was kind of an interesting, why the British kept coming, nobody really knows. But it was something that made Andrew Jackson's name, and ultimately he was able to parlay that into becoming the President of the United States. In 1835, on this date, the U.S. national debt reached zero. That was the first and only time that the U.S. national debt has ever been zero. So, on this date, 1835, the good old days. In 1945, the parachurch organization Youth for Christ was organized. Now, it had started actually a few years earlier. Jack Wurtson was the founder. It was on this date that the meeting was held to create the organization that would later become known as Youth for Christ International. Youth for Christ is still around, and of course most of us can identify Youth for Christ's first full-time employee, and here's a picture of him. Yes, that's right, it's Billy Graham, Youth for Christ's first full-time employee. It was on this date in 1956 that missionaries Nate Saint, Pete Fleming, Ed McCully, Roger Udarian, and Jim Elliott were killed. These were 5 individuals, 5 men that had taken up a missionary endeavor to reach the Wadari or the Ora Indians in and around Ecuador. When they landed, they were met by warriors, and ultimately they were all 5 killed. Of course, Jim Elliott's wife went on to write a couple of books about it. The most well-known is the one in 1957 called Through Gates of Splendor. And in fact, there was a movie, a full-on movie, and I don't know how good the movie is because I only found out about it when I was doing my research for this. But in 2006, there was a movie put out called End of the Spear that tells this story as well. But it was on this date in 1956 that those 5 missionaries were killed. Today is Simon Episcopius's, I don't know how you pronounce it. I'm going to put the name on the screen so that you can see how difficult it would be. I'm not exactly sure how you pronounce this guy's name. Simon Episcopius, perhaps. was born. So he was born on this date in 1583. Now, of course, some of you are wondering, who is Simon Episcopius? Well, I'll tell you, he was instrumental in the creation of Arminian theology, follower of Jacob Arminius. That is the kind of the alternative, or the the reaction to John Calvin and the Calvinists. Episcopius, I'll just read this selection here from the other source of all truth. Wikipedia says he may be regarded as in great part the theological founder of Arminianism, since he developed and systematized the principles tentatively enunciated by Arminians. Okay, so again, he was a great Arminian theologian, born on this date in 1583. Now, this next one I'm going to have to read real fast, but it was on this date in 1909 that Evelyn Wood was born. Now, some of you are going, wait, Evelyn? Yes, that Evelyn Wood, speed reading. She was an English teacher, then got an MA and became fascinated by people who could read quickly. And she developed a system and sold it ultimately for a large amount of money in the early 1960s. Even though not everybody agreed with how effective it was, as I understand it, when John F. Kennedy became president in 1961, or actually was elected in the early 1960, or late 1960, I should say, it was believed that he could read somewhere in the area of 1,200 words a minute. I've never taken an Evelyn Wood speed reading class, but I have taken several speed reading courses, and I can read pretty quickly. I don't know exactly, kind of depends on what I'm reading as far as how quickly I can read it. But Evelyn Wood, the person who started the whole thing, was born in this date in 1909. And finally, this is the big one. It was on this date in 1935 that Elvis Presley was born. I know, why is anybody here? Why aren't we all celebrating? But yes, it was on this date, 1935, Elvis Presley was born. I'll let you decide whether you like young Elvis or perhaps the Elvis that I remember from when I was a kid, the older Elvis. But happy birthday to Elvis. All right, well, let's get back to talking about Luke and Acts. Today, we're going to continue our discussion of Paul's return to Jerusalem and his first defense in front of the crowd. Good morning, welcome back. We're here today to continue our discussion of Luke and Acts. We're in the second half of the book of Acts at this point, and it's seriously on the downhill side in that we're talking about Paul's trip to Rome. In fact, some have argued that this is Paul's fourth missionary journey, and if you want to say that, go ahead. But basically, we're talking about Paul's trip to Rome. Okay, his third missionary journey ends when he arrives back in Jerusalem. Actually, he comes from Antioch down to Jerusalem. Now, in verse 17, we ended up here last week. I'm going to kind of double up on this again. So let's talk about chapter 21, beginning in verse 17. When we, that is Paul and Luke and his group, which, again, couple reminders. Number one, Paul very rarely is ever alone. Okay, he's always surrounded by people. I'm sure there's a lesson there about ministry strategies. But Paul is rarely ever alone. But secondly, we means Luke is with him. Luke, who I believe to be the author of this text. And we know from the earlier passage in verse 12 of chapter 21, that Luke is one of the persons who doesn't think that Paul should be going back to Jerusalem. And again, we kind of talked about this, and this is kind of an interesting thing, that you've got people being led by the Spirit to warn Paul and others to interpret these as saying, you shouldn't go. And so that's kind of one of the interesting elements that we see coming through Acts. Talked about that last week, so I won't get into it anymore today. But it says, when we arrived at Jerusalem, the brothers and sisters received us warmly. The next day, Paul and the rest of us went to see James, and all the elders were present. Okay, Paul greeted them and reported in detail what God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry. Okay, so this is basically a repeat of what had happened in Acts chapter 15. Okay, this is when Paul and Barnabas come through from Antioch, talk about their first missionary journey, and they come in and they explain to James and all the others. Remember, James is the one who signs the letter. James is the one who sends the letter, writes the letter, to the Gentile believers. Okay, so James, we believe this is the brother of Jesus and the pastor, the leader of the Jerusalem church. Okay, so here you have James and all the elders. Okay, when they, that is the leaders, and I'm in verse 20, heard this, they praised God. Okay, again, very similar to what happened in Acts chapter 15. Now, I forgot to mention, the next several chapters, okay, so this is 21, 2, and 3, and possibly parts of 24, all take place within about a 2-week time period, okay? We're a decade, 15 years or so past, maybe 20 years past the resurrection, okay? So we're probably, I'd say, a good 15 years beyond that, maybe 25, but 21 takes place, 21, 22, and 23 all take place within about a 2-week time period. So keep that in mind as we kind of go through here. So when they heard this, they praised God. Then they said to Paul, "You see, brother, how many thousands of Jews have believed, and all of them are zealous of the law." Okay, so now imagine what's happening. Paul has expressed his report to the to the Jewish leaders, James and all the rest. And now they're giving their report back to Paul, okay? And he says, "You see, brother, how many thousands of Jews have believed." See, look, we've got thousands of believers here. And then here's the key. "And all of them are zealous for the law." Now, remember, we've talked about this going on, and that is that Christianity at first, and this is giving the role of John the Baptist, John the Baptist's role was to correct Judaism to look to the Messiah, to look to Jesus, and recognizing that Jesus is the natural development. Now, in modern day parlance, that's referred to as secessionism. And if you're a Jewish person, a person of Jewish faith today, this would really bother you, okay? That Christianity is the natural secession of it. And this is kind of part and parcel of what the problem is relative to the Gentiles coming in. That is that the Gentiles are coming in without that Jewish background, which to somebody for whom Christianity is just the next step in Judaism would have a problem, okay? Because you don't just cut off everything before you, you just take it as the next step, okay? So it would include the Jewish background. And so here, as James and the elders are explaining to Paul, I said, we've got thousands of believers here, and they're all zealous for the law. Okay, now he throws that out there, and I don't know whether Paul realizes what an ominous statement this is, but he's about to get waylaid with that. Okay, "They have been informed," verse 21, "that you teach all the Jews who live among the Gentiles to turn away from Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children or live according to our customs. What shall we do? They'll certainly hear that you have come." Okay, so the problem here is now they're not arguing about the Gentiles, what to do with the Gentiles, and they're going to bring that in a couple of minutes. We'll see that in a couple of minutes, because James makes it real clear that he's not putting any burdens on Gentile believers. He's talking about what about Jewish believers, okay? And at this point, Paul is not willing to throw off the Old Testament law. And I've said that Paul is an obedient Jew, and he makes a point of that, I think, to the end of his life. Okay, and he makes a point of following all of the Jewish customs, all of the Jewish feast days. I think everything that a Jew is supposed to do, Paul did, but he also believed in the resurrection. He believed in Jesus, and in the way, as it were. Okay, so, but James sees a problem with this. James sees a problem that what we're hearing is that you go to these mixed areas and you're telling believers, hey, to believe in Jesus and obtain eternal life and get all of the benefits of this relationship with Jews, you don't have to follow any of the Jewish traditions. And of course, any Jew listening to that might hear this license being given by Paul. Whether Paul actually says that to any Jewish believer or had said it to any Jewish believer, we don't know. There's no record of it in the book of Acts. Okay, so but James sees this as a problem. Okay, they're going to get upset about this. There's going to be a huge row. He says, but I've got an idea. We've got an idea. Okay, so he says, so do what we tell you. Okay, there are 4 men with us who have made a vow. Take these men, join in their purification rites, and pay their expenses so they can have their heads shaved. Then everyone will know there is no truth in these reports about you, but that you yourselves are living in obedience to the law. Okay, so understand what he is saying. So there are 4 men over here who have taken a vow, okay? And it's probably, although we don't exactly know, it's probably some variation of the Nazirite vow. Okay, the Nazirite vow being the one, Samson, shave your head, don't touch dead things, don't alcohol, none of that, okay? Long hair, all of that. Okay, so that's probably what they're doing. And there's some expense to this. Okay, so James' idea is to say, look, why don't you pay for the expenses of these 4? Okay, these 4 guys. Okay, and whether you're going to do it along with them is not clear. Although later on, I think it does kind of suggest that do it along with them. Okay, so you're going to do this along with them, and they're going to do this vow, and you're going to be seen with these 4, and then everybody is recognize that you follow the law. Now, here's the question to ask. Is this a good idea? Okay, is this really a good idea? Again, this is a narrative text, okay? So we don't have to look at these things that they do and say, wow, that is exactly what we need to do, or Paul could have done that, or Paul should have done this, okay? Personally, I don't think this is a really good idea, okay? Because really what you've got here is a teaching moment, okay? What we, in 2022 would refer to as a teaching moment. And this is a chance for James and the leaders to say, look, this is how Christianity works. This is how the way operates, okay? This is what our theology of salvation, our soteriology is, okay? Instead, they create this thing. Now, all that's going to prove is that Paul follows the law, okay? And in Jerusalem, when in Rome, do as Romans do. When in Jerusalem, do as the Jews do. I mean, that's kind of the thing. And the accusation that they throw out earlier is that Paul doesn't say anything about whether or not Paul himself follows the law. The accusation is that Paul is telling other Jews not to follow the law. Now, I get that perhaps if you look at it and they would say, well, if Paul's following the law, why would he tell anyone else not to follow the law? So maybe it seemed like a good idea at the time, okay? Personally, I look at this, I'm like, I don't think this is a good idea. I don't think this is going to work, because even if Paul is there, somebody's going to come in and say, yeah, I get that you're doing this because you're in Jerusalem. But it never gets that far, okay? It doesn't get that far, okay? But he says in verse 25, okay, as for the Gentile believers, we have written to them our decision that they should abstain from food sacrificed to idols, from blood, from meat of strangled animal, and from sexual immorality. Okay, again, that's just a letter from Acts chapter 15. Okay, so James is saying, I'm not talking about the Gentiles. Don't worry about the Gentiles. Any Gentile believers, I'm not putting this on them. It's very clear about that. This is only dealing with Jewish believers, people who are coming out of Orthodox Judaism and becoming a believer in the way. What do we tell them about Jewish practices? Okay, and the assumption here is that they should be following the Jewish practices. Okay, I mean, you pick that up, right? So rather than delve into whether the Jewish practices are still necessary, James is saying, clearly implying that yes, they are if you're a Jewish believer. If you're coming out of the Jewish context, then you need to maintain the Jewish practices. Okay. So Paul goes along with it. Like I said, I don't think this is a good idea. Okay, but again, I'm with Luke here in verse 10. I don't think a lot of what happens here is the best plan. I mean, it works in that ultimately by Acts chapter 28, we've got Paul in Rome. I don't think this is the best way for him to do it, but Paul's got his mind made up, and that's what's going to happen. And again, this is a narrative text, so Luke is just telling the story. Okay. The actions involved don't necessarily have to be inspired or worthy of replication, okay? And by the same token, just because something works doesn't mean we have to go, oh, well, it worked for Paul, it's going to work for us, okay? Not necessarily. Okay, so Paul goes along with it, right? Here in verse 26, it says, the next day Paul took the men and purified himself along with them. Okay, so this purification could involve shaving of the head, could be, ritual cleansing, mikvahs, baths, all this, separation. And in fact, in verse 27, it says, when the 7 days were nearly over. Okay, where does 7 days come from? Okay, well, we don't know exactly why 7 days are important, except that in a couple of passages, Numbers chapter 19, Leviticus 15, there's a couple of different examples that are given in the Torah that state in dealing with cleanliness and ceremonial cleaning and all of that, it involves a 7-day process. Okay, so 7 days seems to be kind of the requisite number if you're going to be going from unclean to clean. Okay, from to a ritual purification process seems to take 7 days. Okay, so he goes to the temple. Then he went to the temple and to give notice of the date when the days of purification would end, and the offering would be made for each of them. Okay, now he goes back to the temple before the 7 days are up. Okay, it says now in verse 27, when the 7 days were nearly over, some Jews from the province of Asia saw Paul at the temple. Okay, now this is not necessarily in the temple, okay, at the temple. So, for example, if I was standing in front of Wrigley Field and you called me up on my phone and said, where are you? I would say I'm at Wrigley Field, even though I'm not inside Wrigley Field. Okay, now I don't think he's inside the temple because he's not ritually clean. And Paul was an observer of the Jewish law. So he would be outside the temple, and he's seen there. Okay, and he's seen by people from the province of Asia. This would include Ephesus. Okay, and I think that's where these are from. Again, we've got another situation where Paul just has people following him, or there's so much traffic going back and forth from these cities, and Paul is such a polarizing figure, well known, that he they see him and they go, hey, that's that guy Paul. Okay, so some Jews from the province of Asia saw Paul at the temple. They stirred up the whole crowd and seized him, shouting, fellow Israelites, help us. Okay, so these guys from Ephesus see Paul. They grab him. Hey, wait, come here. Hey, you, everybody, this guy. Okay, and then they give this. I don't know. It's almost funny. I mean, if it wasn't serious, but it's almost funny. Just listen to this accusation. This is the man who teaches everyone everywhere against our people and our law in this place. Okay, so it's like, okay, so who's he talking? He's teaching everyone everywhere. He's talking to everyone everywhere. Wherever this guy is, everyone everywhere, he's selling this thing. And he's talking against three things: our people, our law in this place, meaning the temple. Okay, so what's left? Okay, this blanket condemnation of Paul and his ministry and his message, just whatever. It's like, hey, this is the guy that's been saying all of those bad things. Okay, and besides, now they've got something in addition, and this is like the only specific charge they have. And besides, he has brought Greeks into the temple and defiled this holy place. They had previously seen Trophimus the Ephesian in the city with Paul and assumed that Paul had brought him into the temple. Okay. Now, Trophimus, we know from from Acts chapter 20, because he's one of the guys. Let's see. If we go back to Acts 20, beginning in verse 4, this is after Ephesus, the uproar in Ephesus. Paul leaves Ephesus and goes through Macedonia, and he has a group of people with him: Aristarchus, Pyrrhus, Secundus, Gaius, Timothy, and Trophimus. Okay, it says Trophimus from the province of Asia. That's where he picked him up, just after Ephesus. Okay, so they had seen this guy and they assumed. Okay, so Luke is making it clear that Paul has not brought him into the temple, but that's kind of what they think he's done. Okay, that's kind of what they think Paul has done. Okay, the whole city was aroused, and the people came running from all directions. Seizing Paul, they dragged him from the temple, and immediately the gates were shut. Okay, now again, this crowd, and we don't know how big the crowd is, but this crowd grabs Paul and pulls him out. Okay, and after they pull him out, the people in the temple guards realize, hey, we got something going on, and shut the doors. Nobody gets in, nobody gets out. Okay. The whole city was aroused, and the people came running. Seizing Paul, they dragged him, and immediately the gates were shut, while they were trying to kill him. So now you've got this crowd of people, a large crowd of people, all circling around Paul, and they're beating on him. Are they using their hands? Are they using sticks? How are they doing? I don't know. They're trying to kill him, and there's only two reasons why Paul is still alive. One is because I'm guessing, given the fact that this is not organized, that nobody here really knows what they're doing, and they're all just kind of flailing on him, and Paul's covered up. And then the second thing, somehow or other, because you've got this huge disturbance going on, it brings the attention of the Roman commander. Okay. So while they were trying to kill him, news reached the commander of the Roman troops that the whole city of Jerusalem was in an uproar. Okay, exaggerate much? I mean, is it the whole city? Well, maybe that's the way the message came. If the Romans are there, somebody goes to the Roman emperor or to the Roman commander and says, this is the military commander, like the police chief, so to speak. Says, listen, the whole city has gone nuts. Okay, now. The Roman commander and the centurions and the soldiers are probably in what was known as the Antonia Fortress. Okay, this was a fortress that had been built by Herod and named after Mark Antony, as in Mark Antony and Cleopatra, that Mark Antony. Okay, so it's called the Antonia Fortress, and it's I believe it's the northwest corner. It's built on the northwest corner of the temple, so they're not very far away. Okay, and it could just be that there's a guard out there and somebody's watching and they see this, okay, and they just see this and they recognize that's not good, that's a fight, hey, crowd's gone nuts. Okay, and so the commander gets up and says, okay, so they're not that far away, so it doesn't take him long, and so you've got probably whatever the number is of unarmed Jews that are just kind of flailing around, and then suddenly you get these Roman soldiers come running up, however they got there. They're gonna part ways. Okay, I'm gonna try and put a picture of the Antonia Fortress here if I can remember it. But so where am I here? Verse 30. It says, seizing Paul, while they were trying to kill him. News reached the commander of the Roman troops at the whole city of Jerusalem. He at once took some officers and soldiers and ran down to the crowd. Okay, when the rioters saw the commander and his soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. Okay, now pay attention to this commander guy. Okay, he becomes very important over the course of the next couple of chapters. Okay, in fact, later on we're going to get his name. I'll leave it for now, but this commander of the Roman is basically the only reason Paul survives. Okay, is this commander. So it's kind of interesting that the only one, it appears, that is actively looking out to protect Paul is this Roman commander. Okay, so the Roman commander comes in. So when the rioters saw the commander, they stopped beating Paul. Okay, verse 33. The commander came up and arrested him, Paul, and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. Okay, now, again, I get the irony here. Why do you arrest the one being beaten? Okay, he does, I don't know, maybe it's something about police groups, but he comes in and arrests Paul and figures Paul had done something to offend all of these people, and no doubt they're screaming and yelling about this guy is bad, this guy's bad, this guy's bad. So we've got the whole crowd pointing to Paul, saying this is the guy that's causing the problem. All right. Then he asked who he was and what he had done. Okay, so again, so basically, you still have this crowd. The guy arrests Paul. He puts Paul in custody. Okay, says he bound him with 2 chains. Some in the crowd shouted one thing and some another. And since the commander could not get at the truth because of the uproar, he ordered that Paul be taken into the barracks. Okay, so again, he's like, okay, what did this guy do? And he did this, he did this, he did this, he did this. Say, all right, come with me. Just, you can't get a straight answer. Come with me. And so they carry him over towards the barracks. Again, this Antonia fortress. When Paul reached the steps, the violence of the mob was so great. Now, this is in the presence of these Roman soldiers. They're still trying to get to him. He had to be carried by the soldiers. The crowd that followed kept shouting, "Get rid of him!" Okay, get rid of him. This is kind of, I don't know, is this sort of reminiscent of what happened to Jesus when Pilate brought him out and they said, "Away with this man, away with him, give us Barabbas, away with him, get rid of him. We don't want him anymore." As the soldiers, the way I see it is there's like a stairway. It just makes sense. I'm imagining this, but it makes sense as far as how the rest of the story goes. So it says, as they were walking up to the crowd, so they're out of the way of the crowd, they're on the stairway, and they're out, and so the crowd can't get to him because he's surrounded by these Roman soldiers. He asked the commander, "May I say something to you?" Now, this is probably, and I think the context suggests, that this is the first time that Paul has actually said anything to the Roman commander. Okay, maybe it was just, because of the noise and all and the cacophony, that this is the first time Paul says anything to the commander. And he says, "May I say something to you?" Okay. "Do you speak Greek?" he replied. Okay. Now, here's the point here. Now, we don't really know what language Paul is speaking here, but it's probably Greek, because this could be surprised. He could be surprised. "Do you speak Greek?" Kind of like you hear something and, "Wait, you speak Greek?" And I think that's the context. Now, it could be that Paul speaks in a language, I don't know, whatever language he says here, we don't really know, because again, we're dealing with a translation of a translation of a translation. But he says, "Do you speak Greek? You speak Greek?" And I think that's kind of what he says. He's surprised that Paul can speak to him in his language. Okay, so the Roman commander is fluent in Greek, which is the trade language. And then he says, "Okay, wow." And he replied, "Aren't you the Egyptian who started a revolt and led 4,000 terrorists out into the wilderness some time ago?" Okay, so Josephus tells a story about this, that there was somebody who was Egyptian. And so the commander assumes that's who it is. And whoever this guy was, he does not expect him to have been able to speak Greek. So the commander is surprised, I think. Okay, the commander is surprised. "Wait, aren't you that guy? That isn't that what this is about?" Okay, so the commander is just trying to figure out what this is all about. And Paul answered, "I am a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no ordinary city. Please let me speak to the people." Okay, so it could be that because Paul had come from, had been out of Jerusalem, that he was in distinctive clothing or non-Jewish clothing. Okay, that's entirely possible. I don't really know. That he didn't look like he was a native Jew. But regardless, he tells the guy, "I'm a Jew from Tarsus, which is no ordinary city." Okay, and I think the point there is to just point out that, listen, I'm not from some backwoods town. Okay, so for example, if I live in the greater Chicago area, and there are a couple of times in my life where I have gone to other relatively large cities, and I've had people talk to me about what it's like to live near this large city. Okay, my wife and I spent some time in Philadelphia, and we were dealing with the issues, in a group, and we were talking about some of the issues facing Philadelphia. Well, Philadelphia is about half the size of Chicago. Okay, and so the persons who are native to Philadelphia would say, "Oh, well, you have to realize the size of Philadelphia." And I would like, well, yeah, I mean, from the Chicago area. Believe me, I know what a big city is like, okay? It's the same thing like if you're from Chicago and you try to explain something to somebody from New York City, they're going to look down and go, listen, I'm from New York City. We know big cities, okay? But it kind of gives some credibility to him to say, listen, I'm not from some backwood community here, okay? I'm from an important city. Okay, I'm a Jew. I'm somebody from an important city. Okay, not a Jewish city. It's a European. Well, it's Asia Minor. Okay, but it's an international city. Okay. He says, "Please let me speak to the people." After receiving the commander's permission, Paul stood on the steps and motioned to the crowd. When they were all silent, he said to them in Aramaic. Now, somehow, and this is interesting to me, somehow or other, despite the fact that a few minutes ago, and again, we don't know how long this process is, okay, now that he's out of their reach, now that he's physically out of their reach, they're a little easier to calm down. And he says, can I talk to him? And they realize that he's talking to the commander. And the commander has given indication that, okay, here. And Paul is able to calm down the crowd somehow. I don't know what he does. Maybe, he's going to calm down, So somehow or other, he manages to calm down the crowd. How long this takes, I don't know. But he manages to quiet down the crowd. And he speaks to them in Aramaic. Now, if you have a King James or New King James, it's going to say he spoke to them in Hebrew. Okay? Well, here's the thing. The New Testament, the Greek does not differentiate between whether they spoke Hebrew or Aramaic. Okay, they use the same word in the Greek to indicate both languages. But they know, based on historical study, that Hebrew would have been the language of the temple. And Aramaic was the common language of the street at the time. So Jesus most likely spoke Aramaic. Now, I am not an Aramaic scholar. I wouldn't know Aramaic if it, well, I guess I do know a couple of words of Aramaic. But it's because he's speaking to this crowd, and he's not speaking in the temple, and he's not speaking in the synagogue, they think he's speaking in the common language, not Hebrew. Okay, and so that's why with the NIV and a lot of the more modern translations, they looked at it and said, well, he had to be speaking Aramaic. Because there's indications even in the New Testament. I believe the Eloi lama sabachthani, the phrase that Jesus says from the cross, is in Aramaic. Okay, and they talk about in this gospel accounts about the messages being nailed above him, putting them in Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic. Okay, so Aramaic was kind of the language of the street. And because he's speaking to the people on the street, they think he's speaking in Aramaic. Okay, now Paul was an educated guy. We know that, very smart. So it's clear that he would have been able to speak Aramaic, and so that's why that is. Okay, that's why the more modern translations, would say it's Aramaic, and King James, New King James says that it's Hebrew. If you want to go with Hebrew, then it's Hebrew. It doesn't, whatever. So then Paul said, now Paul is going to begin the first of two defense speeches that he's going to make in Jerusalem. Okay, he's going to make this speech here to the crowd, and then he's going to make a speech to the Sanhedrin. Okay, now again, he's talking to his people here. Okay, in fact, in both places, he's talking to his people, and he's trying to develop his commonality here. Okay, but he says, I am a Jew, born in Tarsus of Cilicia, but brought up in this city. I studied under Gamaliel and was thoroughly trained in the law of our ancestors. I was just as zealous for God as any of you are today. Okay, so now go back to 21:20, where James said, we've got all these believers and they're all zealous for the law, which kind of makes you think, are there Jewish believers in this crowd? We don't know. But of course, zeal is a great thing. Being zealous is something, I know Isaiah talks about the zeal of the Lord. So being zealous for God is a good thing. And in a way, it's kind of a compliment. It's like, I was as zealous as you are. Okay? I persecuted the followers of this way to their death, arresting both men and women and throwing them into prison, as the high priest and all the council can themselves testify. I even obtained letters from them to their associates in Damascus and went there to bring these people as prisoners to Jerusalem to be punished. So kind of Paul is kind of reminding them, it's like, do you know who I am? I mean, I'm that guy. Okay, remember that story about that guy that was crazy about going into houses and pulling these people out? That was me. That was me. I'm that guy. Okay, so he's like, that's who I am. And I persecuted. I was right there with you. You know, however long it is, and it's probably 15 years or more since that time. So, you know, maybe a lot of them weren't around, aren't young enough to remember it. Okay. But, you know, the gist of it is, you know, 15 years ago, let's just use that as an example. 15 years ago, I would have been right there with you. I would have been right there with you. Okay. And went there to bring these people as prisoners to be punished. Okay. Now, beginning in verse 6, we're going to get the first repeat of Paul's Damascus Road experience. Now, the first time we've read about it was in Acts chapter 9 when it occurred. And that's Luke telling the story. Now, here you have Luke recording Paul telling the story. Okay, so this is Paul's version of it. And for the most part, it's the same. There's a couple of little additions. Okay. About noon, he says, so he's talking, he says, I got letters to go to Damascus, right? In verse 5, it says, I got letters, and he's going to Damascus about noon. Okay, this is an added detail. Okay, noon being the brightest part of the day, right? The sun is the highest point. About noon, as I came near Damascus, suddenly a bright light from heaven flashed around me. And I think we talked about that when we talked about the event in Acts chapter 9, that this was a very, very bright light. A light that was so bright, it blinded them at the brightest part of the day. Okay, so it isn't like it was dark and all of a sudden the lights came on. It was like the lights were already on and an even brighter light came on. Okay, so flashed around me. I fell to the ground and heard a voice saying, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? Who are you, Lord? I asked. I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting, he replied. My companions saw the light, but they did not understand the voice of him who was speaking to me. What shall I do, Lord? I asked. Okay, now this question, Paul's talking to this Christophany, this appearance of Christ, or at least the voice. It's not in the original, and not in the chapter 9 account, but this is Paul saying it. So maybe Paul is just in his mind, or what should I do, Lord? And nobody else can hear what he's saying, but this is Paul in his, replaying the moment. I am Jesus of Nazareth. I'm sorry. Get up, the Lord said, and go into Damascus. There you will be told that all that you have been assigned to do. My companions led me by hand into Damascus because the brilliance of this light had blinded me. Okay, so far, now some of them have heard about this Jesus of Nazareth, and they're kind of wondering, wait, whoa, where's this going? A man named Ananias came to see me. Now, Paul doesn't say anything about Ananias' vision. He just knows that Ananias shows up. Okay, so again, this is from Paul's point of view. Paul doesn't know about Ananias' vision, at least at the time he didn't. I'm sure he does by now. But Paul's just saying this is how it played out to me. A man named Ananias came to see me. He was a devout observer of the law. Okay, again, devout, just like you all are. Okay, we're all devout observers of the law here. And highly respected by all the Jews living there. He stood beside me and said, Brother Saul, receive your sight. At that very moment, I was able to see him. Okay, you remember in chapter 9, it said something like scales fell from his eyes. Then he said, the God of our ancestors has chosen you to know his will and to see the righteous one and to hear words from his mouth. You will be his witness to all people of what you have seen and heard. And now, what are you waiting for? Get up, be baptized, and wash your sins away, calling on his name. Okay, so now he's telling this is how he was converted. And I think, this last part he's kind of he's got to get faster on. Because I'm guessing they're starting to hear a little bit of rumbles coming. A little bit of reaction coming out of the crowd. Okay. When I returned to Jerusalem, I notice he just ignores the whole thing about Damascus and the crowd that was trying to kill him there and escaping through the wall. He just forget that part. Just go straight to his return to Jerusalem. And was praying at the temple. I fell into a trance and saw the Lord speaking to me. Quick, he said, leave Jerusalem immediately because the people here will not accept your testimony about me. So He's in the temple. He's praying in the temple like a good Lord did. And he gets a vision from God in the temple. Okay, now he's putting himself in the same category in the Jewish mind as people like Samuel and Isaiah, other famous Old Testament prophets that had received visions in the temple. And certainly, if God is giving visions in the temple, it's got to be to somebody who's an observant, devout follower of the law. Okay, and I think that's the point the bigger point that Paul is trying to make here. But he's saying, leave Jerusalem because these people aren't good. So, God told me 15 years ago that you all weren't going to believe me. Lord, I replied. Okay. He says, these people know that I went from one synagogue to another to imprison and beat those who believe in you. And when the blood of your martyr Stephen was shed, I stood there giving my approval and guarding the clothes of those who were killing him. Okay. So, again, he's just repeating exactly what he had just told him. What he had just told the crowd. Remember, I'm the guy, and it's telling God the same thing. Verse 21. Then the Lord said to me, "Go, I will send you far away to the Gentiles." Okay, so Paul knows that one of the reasons why the crowd is so upset with him is the fact that he has taken the message of Judaism to the Gentiles in a way that the Jewish leaders and the Jewish Bible scholars don't like. Okay, it's contrary to what they think it should be. So, in order to become a believer in the Jewish sense, it was to accept Judaism and all that goes along with it. The festivals, the law, the sacrifices, the whole nine yards. Okay, so it's Paul's interaction with the Gentiles that's at the root of the problem. And now Paul is telling them, look, it's a message I got in a trance in the temple while being a devout Jew. Okay, it can't be a more legitimate goal that God told me to do this. Okay, the crowd listened to Paul until he said this. Okay, so they know what Paul did when he got there. So the message that Paul was presenting to the Gentiles, that you can become a believer, that you can have a place in God's kingdom without accepting the Jewish religion, without accepting the Jewish Torah, the Mishnah, any of that. They know about this. Enough of them know about this. And they're like, there's no way this could have come from God. And that's where it stops. Okay? The crowd listened to Paul until he said this. Then they raised their voices and shouted, "Rid the earth of him, he's not fit to live." Okay? They're not buying it. The crowd is not buying it. Now, my question here, where are the church leaders? Okay? Where's James and the elders and the 4,000, 5,000 believers in the town? I don't know. Okay? I don't know where they are. It doesn't say. All right? Are they part of this group? Could be. Okay, that could very well be. All right, that there are people that that are zealous for the law that think he's just fundamentally wrong and causing way more damage to the cause than he should be. Okay, verse 23. As they were shouting and throwing off their cloaks and flinging dust into the air, the commander ordered that Paul be taken into the barracks. Okay, this whole idea of flinging off their clothes, dust. Okay, some look at this and say, this is like that, shaking the dust off your feet. They're like, we don't want anything to do with him. We want nothing to do with this guy. Okay. The commander ordered that Paul be taken into the barracks. He directed that he be flogged and interrogated in order to find out why the people were shouting at him like this. Okay, so the commander still hasn't figured it out. He still can't understand what the big deal is. Okay? And so what he does, he says, okay, go interrogate him. Okay? And this is basically the Roman version of questioning. Okay? Like where we had issues with waterboarding and that kind of stuff. This torture questioning process. That's what he's done. Because he figures the only way we're going to get the truth is if we torture it out of this guy. Because I can't get it from all of this crowd. So I got this guy. Let's go in there. Let's torture him. and he'll tell us the truth. Now, they can't just accept what he says because they figure he's going to lie, or they'll just tell him what he wants to hear. Okay, so this is just standard operating procedure for the commander. It's like he can't figure out what these crazy people want. I mean, got this guy, they want to kill him. I don't know why. I'm supposed to keep things in order here. I got this brouhaha, I got this crowd, I got this guy. So he says, well, I'm going to deal with what I can. I'm going to use the tools I have. Here, go. He tells to the centurion, go, take this guy, go torture him, get the truth out of him. It's basically what he says. So they do. As they stretched him out to flog him, verse 25, Paul said to the centurion standing there, is it legal for you to flog a Roman citizen who hasn't even been found guilty? Now remember, in Acts chapter 16 at the Philippian jail, Paul doesn't play the Roman citizen card until after. Now maybe he didn't get a chance. That's what he said. And I said that later on he's going to learn to throw down the Roman citizenship card before they start beating him. Now keep in mind, the crowd has been beating him. So it's not like he's getting away with nothing here. Okay, Paul has been beaten and manhandled by this crowd, and now I don't know what they're doing. They're putting him on a rack, tying him up to a pole, whatever it is they're doing. Paul just says, "Hey, you there, before you start in on me, do you know, is it legal to do this to a Roman citizen?" And the answer to the question is no, it's not. Okay, and rather than simply just demand, he just asks a question. When the centurion heard this, he went to the commander and reported it. What are you going to do? He asked. This man is a Roman citizen. Okay. Now, the point is, he probably figures that there are other people that know that Paul is there. If he is, in fact, a Roman citizen, then other Roman citizens got to know that he's around. The commander went to Paul and asked, tell me, are you a Roman citizen? Okay, now what's interesting is Paul may still be stretched out at this point. Okay, I'm guessing he was like hanging from a, from a pole or something like that, and they were gonna beat him. He may still be hanging. He's like, are you a Roman citizen? Yeah, yes. The commander said, I had to pay a lot of money for my citizenship. Okay, but I was born a citizen, Paul replied. Okay, and that implies sort of a hierarchy, that there's some benefit that a born Roman citizen is somewhat more influential or more likely to have friends in high places than somebody who simply bought his Roman citizenship. Those who were about to interrogate him withdrew immediately. The commander himself was alarmed when he realized that he had put Paul, a Roman citizen, in chains. It's like, uh-oh, this is the moment where it's like, I've got a bad feeling about this. Okay? Got to put an end to this. Okay? Verse 30. The commander, again, now he knows that he's dealing with a Roman citizen. So he's got to do this. He's got to go to plan B. Okay? So the commander comes up with an idea. He said, okay, I'm going to get the Jewish leaders together, and they'll explain to me what's going on. The commander wanted to find out exactly why Paul was being accused by the Jews. So the next day, Paul is there in the barracks or in a cell or whatever. Maybe it's just for his protection. So the next day, he released him and ordered the chief priests and all the members of the Sanhedrin to assemble. Then he brought Paul and had him stand before them. So he orchestrates this meeting. Okay? And then we're going to go into our second defense speech, and we're going to talk about that next week when we talk about chapter 23, when we talk about Paul in front of the Sanhedrin. So, thank you very much for being with me, and if you have any questions, by all means, let me know. Shoot me an email, phone call, pull me aside in church, and we can talk about it then. Next week, we'll get back into talking about Acts chapter 23. Thank you very much.